October 25th, 1944, 0700 hours, off the coast of Samar, Philippines. The sea was calm, unnervingly calm. A thin mist hung over the waves as the morning sun rose, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and grey. On the deck of the USS Johnston was DD 557, a Fletcher-class destroyer. Men stretched, drank coffee, and joked quietly as they prepared for another long day of escort duty. They were part of Task Unit 77.4.3, better known as Taffy 3, a small ragtag group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their job was simple: guard the jeep carriers that launched air support for the invasion of Leyte Gulf. No one aboard Johnston imagined that within minutes they would face the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. On the bridge, Commander Ernest E. Evans, a half-Cherokee officer from Oklahoma, leaned against the railing, squinting into the morning haze. The man was known for his grit and his bluntness. On the day he took command of Johnston, he told his crew, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Today, fate was about to test that promise. At 0647, a lookout shouted from the mast, "Ships on the northern horizon, lots of them." Evans grabbed his binoculars. Through the lenses, he saw towering silhouettes emerging from the mist. Massive warships, their superstructures bristling with guns. Battleships, cruisers, dozens of them. Within moments, the bridge filled with the harsh voices of radar and communications officers. "Contacts confirmed. Bearing 320 degrees. Multiple heavy ships. Closing fast." Evans' jaw tightened. There was no doubt who they were. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Centaur Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kureta, had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait overnight. Now it bore down directly on Taffy 3. The radio erupted. "This is Taffy 3. We are under attack. Repeat, we are under attack by a large surface force." In Tokyo, Japanese officers had long dismissed American escort groups as tin cans. Lightly armed, thinly armoured ships, barely capable of defending themselves. They expected this one to scatter and die. But aboard Johnston, Commander Evans didn't hesitate. He turned to his helmsman and barked, "Hard left rudder. Come to course 250, sound general quarters." The klaxons blared through the ship. Men scrambled to their battle stations. Ammunition handlers passed shells hand to hand. Gunners swung turrets toward the horizon. And from the north, the first salvo came. A thunderclap that rolled across the ocean. The Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, opened fire from 20 miles away. Its 18-inch shells screamed overhead like freight trains, their passage shaking the very air. When they struck the water, they exploded in geysers as tall as buildings. "Jesus," whispered a sailor. "They're firing at us already." Evans grabbed the intercom. "All engines ahead flank. Make smoke. We're going in." The Johnston accelerated, her twin screws churning the sea into white foam. The ship's wake trailed behind like a defiant banner as she charged toward an enemy that outweighed and outgunned her 10-1. "Range to target, 18,000 yards, shouted the gunnery officer. "Fire when ready." The Johnston's 5-inch guns barked to life. Shells arced through the sky, exploding against the lead Japanese cruiser. Sparks flashed. Metal tore. For the men of Taffy 3, there would be no retreat. Only the sound of thunder, the smell of smoke, and the grim determination to make the enemy bleed for every inch of ocean. The tin cans were going to war. 07:15 hours. The Philippine Sea boiled with fire. Columns of black smoke rose from the horizon as Taffy 3's escort carriers, small, slow, and nearly defenseless, came under brutal bombardment. Shells from Japanese battleships splashed closer with every minute, their thunder shaking the thin decks of the carriers Gambia Bay, White Plains, and Fanshawe Bay. On the bridge of USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans stood steady at the helm, eyes locked on the approaching enemy. Ahead lay an armada of death, the battleships Yamato, Nagato, Congo, Haruna, and a dozen heavy cruisers with 8 and 14-inch guns. His destroyer weighed barely 2,000 tons. The Yamato alone displaced 70,000. "Range closing, 15,000 yards!" shouted the fire control officer. Evans slammed his fist onto the chart table. "We're going in closer." "Sir?" a young officer stammered. "If those bastards want a fight, we'll give them one they'll never forget." As Johnston weaved through the curtain of geysers thrown up by enemy shells, Evans ordered a torpedo attack. The ship's crew swung their torpedo tubes to starboard, aligning them with a massive cruiser, the Kumano. "Steady, steady. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes streaked across the waves, their wakes glowing silver. Seconds later, a thunderous explosion. A fireball erupted from Kumano's bow, ripping it apart. The Japanese cruiser lurched out of formation, trailing smoke and flame. Cheers erupted aboard Johnston, but Evans wasn't finished. He turned the destroyer broadside, laying down a wall of smoke to shield the carriers from the advancing fleet. "Keep firing!" he roared. "Give them everything we've got!" The Johnston's 5-inch guns hammered away at impossible range, targeting battleships 5 times her size. The gunners could see their shells bursting harmlessly against thick armour. But still, they fired. Every shot bought another second for the carriers to launch planes and flee eastward. Meanwhile, 10 miles astern, the destroyers USS Hull and USS Herman were also turning to attack. Captain Leonard Evans of Hull radioed. "Taffy 3, this is Hull. Commencing torpedo run. See you in hell." The 3 tin cans charged together, their wakes slicing the sea like arrows. Japanese lookouts aboard Yamato couldn't believe what they were seeing. "The enemy destroyers are attacking," one officer shouted. Kurita himself watched from the bridge, stunned. "They are charging us? With destroyers?" At 0730, Howell and Herman launched torpedoes at the battleships Haruna and Congo, forcing them to turn away in confusion. The precision of the American attack and the audacity of it threw the entire Japanese formation into chaos. Battleships turned in different directions to evade, breaking the tight battle line that had been Kurita's strength. But the price was heavy. A shell from Yamato's main battery struck Johnston's stern, shredding the aft gun mount. Another slammed into the bridge, blowing Evans off his feet and severing communications. Blood covered his face. One arm hung limp. He climbed back to his feet anyway and shouted into a handheld microphone, "Keep firing, damn it! Keep firing!" In the chaos, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the gunnery officer, took over targeting manually. He sighted a Japanese cruiser through the drifting smoke and barked, "Gun 51, on target! Fire!" The deck thundered with recoil. Each blast was an act of defiance against the inevitable. At 0745, the air above the battle filled with American aircraft, Wildcats and Avengers from the escort carriers, hastily armed with depth charges and small bombs. They dove fearlessly into the maelstrom, strafing Japanese decks and dropping their makeshift weapons. The destroyers below cheered as the planes joined their suicidal defense. Together, steel and sky fought as one. By 0800, the sea was a vision of madness, geysers, smoke, and fire merging into one living storm. Destroyers zigzagged through the chaos, slamming torpedoes into cruisers, trading their lives for time. And still, the tin cans fought on, outgunned, outnumbered, but never out of courage. As the Japanese formation faltered in confusion, Commander Evans gave his final order. "All ahead flank, will draw their fire. The carriers must live." The USS Johnston turned again into the fight, her guns blazing, her decks on fire, her crew bleeding but unbroken. They weren't supposed to survive the morning, but by God, they were going to make the Japanese remember it forever. 0815 hours. The sea off Samar had turned into an inferno. Smoke blanketed the horizon, thick as fog, and flashes of orange lit the waves where shells struck. The thunder of naval guns rolled endlessly across the water. Overhead, the whining dive of aircraft mixed with the whistle of incoming fire. It was chaos made of steel. Aboard USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans limped along the bridge wing, his face and uniform smeared with blood. The ship was already crippled. Her steering jammed, radar gone, half her guns silenced. But Evans refused to leave the fight. "Damage control to the bridge," came a crackling voice through the intercom. "We've lost power to the aft engines, sir. Taking on water." Evans grabbed the handset. "Patch her up however you can. We're not done yet." Below deck, sailors worked in choking smoke, knee-deep in seawater. They passed buckets hand to hand, plugging holes with rags and wooden boards. The heat from fires forward turned the compartments into ovens. Some men collapsed, overcome by smoke, and were dragged out by their shipmates. Up top, Lieutenant Robert Hagan kept the forward guns, firing manually. Each blast rocked the deck as he shouted coordinates to the remaining gun crews. "Range 10,000! Enemy cruiser port side!" Gunther 51 fired again. A shell struck a Japanese heavy cruiser, the Chokai, tearing into her forward turrets. Flames erupted from her bow. Hagan turned and smiled grimly. "That's for Hoel." To port, the USS Hull was dying. She'd taken dozens of direct hits, her bridge obliterated, her hull broken. Yet even as she sank, her crew continued to man their guns, firing until the water swallowed the barrels. Survivors floating in the debris watched her slip beneath the waves, still shooting. Meanwhile, the USS Herman, the only destroyer still maneuverable, weaved between towering columns of water. Her captain, Commander Amos Hathaway, yelled, "Give them hell, boys!" as he fired torpedoes at the Yamato herself. The torpedo wakes streaked toward the giant battleship, forcing her to turn sharply away. Inside Yamato's bridge, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood in stunned silence. He had expected a clean victory. 6 destroyers and a handful of escort carriers crushed beneath the guns of his mighty fleet. Instead, the Americans were fighting like cornered wolves. These are escort ships," he muttered. "Impossible." Japanese shells continued to fall, but their aim was broken. The destroyers' smoke screens had turned the battle into a ghost fight, silhouettes flashing in and out of fog. Japanese gunners reported phantom fleets, overestimating their enemy's size by tenfold. In the confusion, Kurita believed he was facing a major American task force. At 0830, Tafia 3's carriers began launching every plane they had left, some armed with nothing more than machine guns or depth charges. Pilots flew anyway. They dove through flak and smoke, strafing decks, dropping empty fuel tanks to distract gunners. From the carrier's radio came a voice. "This is White Plains. Our planes are out of ammo. We're making dry runs to scare them." The destroyers below answered with cheers. Evans turned to his crew. "See that, boys? Even the flyboys are throwing rocks. We're not stopping." By now, Johnston was burning from bow to stern. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, already wounded from the morning's torpedo hit, loomed again through the haze. Evans pointed to her. "Target that bastard. All guns. Fire." The Johnston's 5-inch cannons spat flame, the recoil trembling through her dying hull. Shells clanged against Kumano's superstructure, starting secondary fires. The Japanese ship turned away once more, smoke pouring from her decks. Then, a final blow, a volley from Yamato's secondary guns. The shells slammed into Johnston's side, ripping open her hull. The destroyer slowed, shuddered, and began to list to port. Evans ordered, "Abandon ship." Men hesitated. "Sir, what about you?" Evans shook his head. "A captain goes down with his ship." At 0945, the USS Johnston slipped beneath the waves, her flag still flying. Of her 327-man crew, only 141 would survive to be pulled from the sea days later. But her sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese formation, bloodied, confused, and disoriented, began to turn away. Despite their overwhelming power, the mighty fleet retreated, convinced they faced a much larger American force. At 10:15, Admiral Kurita gave the fateful order. All ships, reverse course. We are withdrawing. The tin cans had done the impossible. They had stopped the Imperial Navy. 10:30 hours, October 25th, 1944. The Battle off Samar was dying down, but the sea still trembled with the echo of its fury. Columns of black smoke stretched across the horizon, and the water was littered with burning debris. Oil slicks, splintered lifeboats, and the floating remains of men and machines. The cries of survivors carried over the waves, mingling with the hiss of steam from crippled ships. Aboard the USS Heermann, the last American destroyer still afloat, damage control parties fought to keep her alive. Fires raged below decks, hoses snaked through corridors, and every man who could still stand worked shoulder to shoulder, eyes stinging from smoke and salt water. Her decks were pitted with shell holes, her aft guns half submerged, but she was still fighting. Commander Amos Hathaway wiped grime from his face and looked toward the horizon, and what he saw was almost impossible to believe. The Japanese fleet was turning away. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, began a slow turn to the northwest, followed by Kongo, Nagato, and a line of battered cruisers. Their once perfect battle line was in shambles, trails of oil marking the spots where Chokai and Suzuya burned out of control. The Imperial Japanese Navy, pride of the empire, was retreating from a handful of destroyers and escort carriers. Hathaway stared for a long moment, then spoke softly to no one in particular. They're leaving. The giants are running. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Takeo Kurita stood motionless on the bridge. The sea around him was calm again, yet inside he felt only confusion and disbelief. His officers pressed for pursuit. The American carriers were crippled and fleeing. Victory was within reach. But Kurita shook his head. "No," he said finally. "It's a trap. There are more of them waiting." In truth, there were none. The nearest US heavy fleet was hundreds of miles away. But Kurita could not know that. From the smoke and chaos of the battle, he had seen the impossible. Destroyers charging battleships, torpedo wakes crisscrossing like nets, aircraft attacking endlessly from the sky. His fleet had faced madness itself and flinched, and so the mighty center force turned back toward the San Bernardino Strait, retreating into legend. By noon, the sea was quiet again. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 drifted slowly east, many listing badly. The Gambia Bay lay capsized, her hull still smoking from the barrage that sank her. Survivors clung to wreckage, scanning the skies for rescue planes. In the distance, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort that had fought like a full-size battleship, was sinking stern first. Her captain had called her a destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, because that's what the situation required. Men floated in the water, shivering in oil and blood, watching the horizon. Some wept, some laughed in disbelief. They had fought the entire Imperial Japanese fleet, and somehow it had been enough. At 1500 hours, aircraft from Taffy 2, operating further south, began to arrive overhead. One pilot radioed, his voice choked. "My God, they're everywhere. Survivors all over the water." He circled low, tipping his wings in salute to the men waving from the sea. When word of the battle reached Admiral William Bull Halsey, far to the north, he refused at first to believe it. How could destroyers fight off battleships? He asked. The answer was simple. They had no other choice. Later, a survivor from the Johnston put it more plainly. "We didn't have a chance in hell, so we took it anyway." The official tally of the battle off Samar would tell a strange story. 3 destroyers and 1 escort carrier lost, hundreds of sailors killed, but in return, Japan's greatest surface fleet had been driven back. When the survivors were rescued days later, oil slicked and sunburned, many asked about Commander Ernest Evans. None had seen him after Johnston went down. He had last been spotted on deck, shouting orders through the smoke, his uniform torn, his left arm gone. He went down with his ship, Months later, the Navy awarded him the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive it. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, Commander Evans led his destroyer against overwhelming odds and inflicted severe damage on a far superior enemy force." As night fell over Samar, the waves lapped gently against the floating wreckage. The stars came out one by one, their reflections trembling on the Black Sea. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the Johnston, the Howell, and the Samuel B. Roberts, ships the Japanese once called tin cans. And yet, on that day, those tin cans had stood taller than battleships. They had fought giants and made them retreat.